this quote from Santiago Ramon y Cajal, who's a Spanish Nobel laureate, best known as the father of modern neuroscience. And he recognized that these really sort of creative, innovative people had these wide interests, and that sometimes they were totally disconnected, but often they would kind of inform one another. And so his quote was, "To him who observes them from afar, it looks as though they are dissipating their energies when in fact they are channeling and strengthening them." And that's what a lot of psychologists who study creativity have seen, that there are these broad interests that from the outside look totally disconnected, but for the individual, they often end up, feeding into the way they think or the way they approach things or their interests.
Hey everybody, today my guest is David Epstein. David is a former senior writer at Sports Illustrated. He's the author of New York Times bestseller, The Sports Gene, and he's got a new book out, Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. And in this episode, David and I talk about his own path as a generalist and how he's been able to make changes in his career. We talk about the relationship between specialization and burnout. And we talk about how if you want to make a change in your own career, you can do that and keep advancing. David, I was reading your book and I felt like, wow, we have a lot in common, which I'm sure we'll get to. But then I realized I think a lot of people relate to you and your story and your book. What do you think makes this topic of generalists so timely right now?
I think a lot of it is that people are being pushed to be so specialized, and that maybe a lot of people don't want to. This is kind of interesting. A lot of the academics that I interviewed in the course of reporting Range, after, at some point would sort of say that they had hoped to be more sort of expansive in their intellectual journeys when they got into academia and felt this pressure to be very specialized, which was sort of really interesting, right? Because on the one hand, a lot of them are very specialized, but they would like to be less so in some cases. I mean, on the other hand, you think they are really like living this life of the mind, right? So they should be able to kind of wander mentally. So I think some of it is just that a lot of people feel pressured to be more specialized than they would of their own accord. I think some people genuinely enjoy being very specialized, but I think a lot of people feel like they should be, but that sort of causes this cognitive dissonance with what they would like to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, as I said, we have a few things in common. One of them was that I was in academia. I did my graduate work at Columbia University, where you did as well.
Oh, what were you in?
I was in physiology.
Okay.
And
cool.
And while
were
I
you
was
at the
there,
mailman school, or were you at the main campus?
Main campus and the medical school. I did
Gotcha.
research up there. And while I was there and I was like on this track, I was in a PhD program, I realized, boy, I don't think this is for me. This is very, very particular. Academia, you find this tiny niche and then you just try to dominate it.
Very quickly, you have to find that niche too. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I was 22 and trying to figure out what I'm going to do for decades. And so I wonder, what was your journey like for those who don't know you?
Yeah. So I was living in a tent in the Arctic when I decided to try to become a writer. So, I mean, when I was a teenager, I was like, sure, I was going to go to the Air Force Academy and be a test pilot and astronaut, and even got through the physical tests and congressional nomination, all that stuff. And then the last minute kind of decided maybe that wasn't right for me. Mm-hmm. And so I went to Columbia as an undergrad thinking I would study political science. Didn't turn out to love it as much as I thought. This is kind of funny, but in order to try to have I ran track in college. In order to try to have a lighter class load during track season, I took a summer class at this campus out in Arizona that Columbia leased. I took a geology class out there, and I was blown away. Like really, just so I could have an easier track season, and I was totally blown away. I'd never been in deserts before. Like you see this life is like spread out horizontally, clinging to its little veins of water. And I was like, God, I'm fascinated by how is this basin and range system that's out in Arizona, like how did this form? And I'm getting interested in earth systems. And so it was just totally mind expanding experience that I had no intention of, doing anything with except for having an easier track season. And I just sort of said, whatever gives me more of this, is the classes I want to take. So I went back out there in the summer, studied astronomy and geology. And here's sort of, I'm giving you sort of the medium long version of my career progression here. But there's sort of a sad part to this story too, which is, so I ended up going to grad school in the geological sciences. But while I was in college, I'd been a competitive runner, and one of my training partners dropped dead at the end of a race. He was one of the top ranked guys in his age group in the country. And I was curious how this could happen to someone that age. And, our newspaper said heart attack. And I'm like, what does that even mean for someone in that state of health? And eventually I got his family signed a waiver allowing me to gather up his medical records and sort of investigate. And turned out he was misdiagnosed. He had this disease caused by a single genetic mutation that is almost always the cause of athletes dropping dead. And, so that sort of stayed on my mind. I wanted to bring awareness to it. And at the same time, I was going off to grad school, right, and living up in the Arctic. And like you said, getting so specialized so fast, where I'm really like, tent in the Arctic is a good place to have time to ask yourself, am I the type of person who wants to spend my whole life learning one like pretty abstruse thing that's new to the world, or much shorter spans of time learning things new to me, sharing them, integrating them? And I was definitely the latter. And I really wanted to do something about what I'd learned about sudden cardiac death in athletes. So I decided I would merge my interests in sports and science and try to write about sudden cardiac death in athletes for a popular audience, not people like maybe you and me who might be like, spending their disposable income on Scientific American or whatever. And so I did that. So I tried to get into writing. I worked a series of very strange jobs. And in fact, I wrote a cover story on that while a temp fact checker at Sports Illustrated. And they sort of realized maybe, I had taken my very ordinary science skills and took them into a sports magazine where suddenly they're totally extraordinary. And that gave me this sort of unique thing to do. And I became the senior writer there. It was really interesting because when I arrived, I'm a temp fact checker for people who are like 6 and 7 years younger than me. But then once this sort of unique mix of skills came together, I sort of like zoomed up and became the youngest senior writer. So it was very much, very much grew out of having this weird background, basically. So it's kind of relevant to a lot of the things I wrote about.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you got your Brooks running T-shirt on.
Oh, I didn't even. Oh, this is me dressing for the job I want means wearing running clothes all day.
Oh, really? Oh, nice.
Sorry, so you were saying you were also running?
I was also a long distance runner at my university and stuff. So again, another sort of common link. And I wonder, you've written the Sports Gene, you've written for Sports Illustrated. How does your argument and range play out with athletes?
Yeah, so it's sort of, that was some of the genesis of it, really. After the Sports Gene, I got invited to debate Malcolm Gladwell at this conference called the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. And so specifically about athletic development, because I had criticized the 10,000-hour rule in my first book. And as Malcolm introduced me at a recent panel, he said, this is David, who devoted several pages of his first book to criticizing my work. But so we were invited to this debate, first time we've ever met. And, he's obviously like a pretty bright fellow. And I didn't want to get embarrassed on stage. And so I tried to anticipate his arguments. And he'd written about, the primary importance of early specialization in deliberate practice. So it's okay, I'm the science writer at Sports Illustrated. If that's the hypothesis, let me go look at the data. And turns out that in most sports, when scientists track athletes over their whole development, they see that they actually have early on what they call sampling period, where they play broad variety of sports. They gain these sort of broader general skills. Importantly, they learn about their own abilities and their own interests, and they delay specializing until later than peers who plateau at lower levels. So I brought this up in the debate. And when we came off the stage, I basically said, like, this is your hypothesis and this is the data that would test your hypothesis. And when I came off the stage, he said, you got me on that one. That's good. That's good. You should write about that. And he then invited me to run. We became running buddies. He's a total track nerd, massive. And so we would talk about this on our own time. And, that sort of through this other experience that I write about in the introduction, where I interacted with these career changers who are military veterans, I realized that the sports data could just serve as like an analogy or a jumping off point for all these other domains, basically.
Yeah, and you've obviously done that. So the sampling period being a key factor, how can people effectively do that when they're trying to make big decisions?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what I do is, because I've career changed a ton. Few people know this, but 2 weeks after the Sports Gene came out, I left Sports Illustrated and went to this place called ProPublica that does, at the time was basically like a startup nonprofit doing all investigative work. And so like all of a sudden I'm having this like being more associated with a single work than I ever have before. I'm the sports science guy or whatever. And I'm like off going to like report on drug cartels and stuff. Like, so it's like it's like split of my identity. And for me, I try to, I think I'm a pretty good self-regulatory learner. So I tend to like frequently be reflecting on like what I think my weaknesses are and what things I want to learn and what interests I want to explore. And I actually do this in like a very sort of formalized way with what I call a book of small experiments, basically, which when I got out of track, actually, so I was very diligent about keeping a training journal and goals journal for track. And I'm only bringing this up because we mentioned we were both college runners. So, and I'd have these goals. And when I transitioned that to, my non-running life, I found it actually did not work as well for me because just doing the same things, doing the same kind of training and goals aren't black and white as they are in track and not easy to measure. And so I use what I call this book of small experiments, where it's more like what I would have had when I was a grad student. But the hypothesis is about me. It's, what interest do I want to explore? What skill would I like to build? Things like that. And then I'll put a hypothesis for how I could do that or explore something. And then I'll try to dip a toe into whatever it is. And then I use the journal to come back and reflect, because reflection is one of the most important aspects of self-regulatory learning, on how that fit what my hypothesis was. And I do this constantly. And one of the interesting ways, if I can go off on like a slight tangent here, if that's okay, that this played into range was I kind of got in a rut with my writing in range at a certain point. I was having trouble just structuring the amount of information. And so I don't know, some things just didn't feel right. And so I decided to I knew I needed to like level up my skills in an aspect of writing, but I didn't really know how to do it. And I saw an ad for an online beginner's fiction writing course. So I signed up for that. And, nobody cares what you've done in that, right? And I take that, and it sort of led to a revelation. Like, one of the exercises was writing a story with no dialogue. And when I did that, I realized, coming from ProPublica, where I was now some years away from having written a book, you're sort of more news oriented and you use quotes a lot more to do explanation. And I had been doing that in the book. And I think that is not so good in a book. Like, I was leaning on quotes to do explanation, where I just needed to understand things better and write them in narrative writing, and I needed to report them deeper. And I went through the whole manuscript and stripped a huge number of quotes, realized it alerted me to what I had to understand better, that I was using quotes from other people to say because I didn't really get it necessarily. So I was sort of papering over it. And it was sort of scary in the sense that I didn't, I felt competent enough and experienced enough in what I was doing that until I like knocked myself out of that mindset with this beginner's course, I didn't really go back and realize how I could, raise my game a little bit. So I've taken other beginner's writing courses since then. And I'm now convinced that there is no amount of beginning writing courses I could take and cease to learn anything from. Like, one of them, no joke, I live like 3 blocks away from a hotel that has a bunch of conventions. And there was like a Japanese comic book convention at it, which I noticed because all of a sudden there were like a ton of wizards in my neighborhood, and seriously, I was like, something's going on over there. And so I just went over there and buy a ticket and go to the beginner's class on like Japanese comic book writing. And I'm not going to write Japanese comic book, probably not, but they're talking about dialogue, and they're talking about narration and pacing and structure and all this stuff. And so I just try to make sure that I'm at least monthly, like getting something entered in that small book of experiments, even if it's just something like, here's a field of work I'm interested in. Who do I know? Who might be in my network, or who can I reach out to that works in that area that I can just talk to and learn a little bit about it? So I don't let a month go by where I'm not doing something that's outside of what my like normal inertia would be in my normal work.
Wow, that takes so much humility, though. I mean, you have like these titles and credentials, best-selling author, Sports Illustrated senior writer. How do you kind of get past that?
Yeah, I don't pay attention to any of that stuff really. I'm very much like, what have I done for me or anyone else lately? And I would say the older and more mature I've got, like the less stock I put in that stuff. I'm much more oriented toward, first of all, like what I'm doing on a daily basis than like any of those titles and credentials. And I don't mistake taking myself seriously for like taking my work seriously, And I've seen other writers. I think you can really do yourself a disservice if you get so comfortable with your competence that you stop working on stuff, right? Like if we think about this in running, right? If we did the same training the same amount of times every year, like you might not slide backward, but you're not going to get that adaptation that you want. Yeah. You have to do different stuff. And so, yeah. And also, I mean, I think there are a couple things to it, right? I feel like I came across this Zen concept of the beginner's mind. And I feel like it was very much resonated with me, where by the time I have a book, like by the time Range came out, I had been done with it for a while, and I'm already like, once again, a freshman in life, like looking for my next project. So it's like I already feel like a total beginner when people are giving you attention. And I've always been like that. When I became a staff writer at Sports Illustrated, I felt like I wanted to learn some investigative skills, and I was kind of plateauing. I felt like there weren't a lot of people inside SI that could teach me much of that stuff. Like my reporting partner had Selena Roberts, who had done a lot of investigative stuff. She'd left, and so I felt like I was sort of plateauing. And so I applied for an internship at ProPublica, which again is this nonprofit investigative operation. And they contacted me and were like, "Do you realize you're applying for you're going to be like scanning documents for people and like your staff writer at Sports?" I'm like, "Can I have it or not?" And so they gave it to me. And so I went from being a staff writer, I had a window over 6th Avenue in Manhattan and everything, to scanning documents for the transportation reporter at ProPublica. And it was great. It was great because I learned how he does stuff, and he's a great reporter. And eventually I went back to ProPublica, so I was just being around these investigative reporters and learning how they worked, because I already knew how the people at my place worked, basically. And it turned out to be like one of the greatest things for, skill building. And then I actually went back to work there. But it didn't bother me to go from being staff writer to intern. If I feel like I'm working on a skill, then I'm like entertained enough that the titles and stuff don't really matter to me.
So if this is working so well for you, and you cite a bunch of examples in your book that I'm sure we'll get to, why is specialization so attractive?
I think there are a number of reasons. One, I think there's a lot of holdover from just Taylorism, basically, which is the science of management efficiency, pretty much. I still think a lot of a huge part of our education system is still structured the way it became structured for Taylorism, to prepare people for an industrial world, right? To sort of, and that made a lot of sense for an industrial world where, what I kind of call the kind learning environment. Well, not psychologist Robin Hogarth calls the kind learning environment, where you're doing these sort of repetitive things. You can count on work next year looking like last year, similar challenges over and over. And in that system, it makes a lot of sense to specialize. So one, I think it's just sort of some cultural momentum where we haven't switched our mindset for the knowledge economy and the creativity economy. But also, one of the themes in Range to me is that the things you can do to cause the most rapid apparent short-term improvement sometimes undermine long-term development. And I find that deeply counterintuitive, right? This one of these studies that testified to that, this one of the U.S. Air Force Academy, if you want to talk about it, was one of the ones that was most deeply counterintuitive to me, because it makes sense to get a head start when you can have a head start. Like, why not specialize in the sport you're going to go on to? Even when I was at SI, I would get contacted by college students who all the writers would, by college students saying, if I wanted to work at SI or ESPN or wherever in the industry, what should I major in? The question I would get is, should I major in journalism or English? And my first instinct was to say journalism. So I'm like, if that's what you want to do, get a head start. My second instinct was to say English. And then, if I waited, it was to say, well, I'd study geology and astronomy, so I have no idea. But I don't know, statistics course never hurt anyone, right? But it was even my instinct, even knowing my own background, to tell people might as well get a head start, So I think it's often well-meaning, right? When it comes from parents, I think it's very much like they want you to be okay. And it's much more intuitive and structured when you can see this sort of linear progression. So I think it's part the intuition. I think it's part cultural inertia.
David, a lot of people ask me, hey, what do you think I could do to find my passion? What advice do you have based on all the research you've done on career and things?
Yeah, I think first of all, so this is where the work of Herminia Ibarra that's in Range really resonated with me, and particularly sort of two phrases keep coming into my head, because again, I have no idea what I'm going to do next also, so I'm in this phase of looking for whatever's next. And the two phrases that she used that resonated with me, so she studies how people make successful career transitions and unsuccessful career transitions, but she studies how people make career transitions. And one of the phrases was, we learn who we are in practice, not in theory. And what she means by that is that psychological research shows that, despite this industry of personality tests that purport to give you the template of yourself and then you just go fit it to some work in the world or whatever, those are just cross sections. And if you give those to people at different times, they evaluate themselves very differently because they've had different experiences, and they've also just we know there are lots of personality changes just happen with age. which is why we often like look back and are like, I can't believe I did that, right? Because we've changed. But so she says, we learn who we are in practice, not in theory, meaning that instead of just having a theory and introspecting about ourselves, we're actually not necessarily so great at gaining tons of knowledge, self-knowledge, by just introspecting before doing stuff. So the other thing she says is act and then think. You have to actually go out and do stuff and then reflect on how it fit your interests and abilities. And this shows up in a whole bunch of research. Like one of the studies I really liked was an economist who wanted to look at the trade-off between early and late specialization in higher education. And he found this natural experiment in England and Scotland where very similar school systems basically, except the English students have to specialize earlier. And he wanted to see who wins this trade-off. And what he saw was that the English students the early specializers get out to a income lead when they leave because they have more domain-specific knowledge. The late specializers, though, they get to sample different things, and so they end up with faster growth rates because they have better match quality. And so they close that income gap very quickly. Meanwhile, the English students start quitting their career tracks in much higher numbers. And because they were made to choose so early that they choose poorly.
Right. And then at that point they've got a mortgage and a car and
That's right. That's right. And their growth rates are faster once they move. So they're still moving in relation to good, to information, but that and other research like Steve Levitt, the Freakonomics economist, as people know him, ran this cool experiment where people would flip a digital coin on his website to decide like major life choices. And the most common question people asked was, should I quit my job? And there was a causal effect of the coin flip on what people decided to do, and then a causal effect on their happiness. So if they flipped the coin that said leave your job and they did it, those people were like happier when he would check in with them at different time points down the road. And so I think one of the conclusions from that study was, it pre-selected for people who are already asking this question, but I think it was, if you're thinking about changing your job, you probably should, right? And I think we should view our entire career as partly the pursuit of match quality, right? That never has to end. So a lot of the people in range didn't set out, almost none of them set out to say like, I'm going to be a generalist. They set out in pursuit of match quality, in trying to find a good fit for their interests and abilities. And instead of just sticking with something and falling prey to the sunk cost fallacy of like, I've already started, so I can't switch, which you and I both for sure had to battle with if we left science grad school. And I don't know if you got it, but I certainly got it of like, you should just stick with it, just finish the PhD and then do something else. But instead of doing that, they take this much more short-term planning approach where they don't look around at who has more than them and is younger. They say, here's who I am today. Here are my skills. Here are my interests. Here are the opportunities in front of me. I'm going to try this one. And then maybe a year from now, I'll change because I will have learned something about myself. And they keep doing that. It's not like a process that ends. So I think it's that kind of habit of mind that gives you the best probability, the best chances of continually improving your match quality. Because we can assume that most people probably no more find the perfect match for themselves than they find like the most suitable spouse in the entire world for themselves. But you can go about it by taking some data and learning about yourself and learning about other people in the world and trying to improve those matches until you stick.
So if someone's thinking they want to try and maybe adjust out of their career, how could they make one of those small experiments while still hedging their bets and not going unemployed too long?
Yeah, that's what Herminia's work is really about too, because she talks about working identity a lot because she says like you're not usually taking these flying leaps from one career to another, and work is part of our identity, and identity doesn't change overnight. So it usually happens in these very small like stages. Somehow someone will get like a keyhole view into some other area of work, or there's this famous work called The Strength of Weak Ties that's about like how people get new jobs, and what that means, strengths of weak ties, is it usually comes not from people in their core network, because those people tend to be working in like a similar area to them, and they already know kind of what those people have to offer. So it'll be like these more chance encounters with people on the fringe of their network who open up something that they didn't know as well. And so I think part of it is if you're feeling antsy, of course you can take a class or things like that, but I always find it's really interesting. Like the first science writer I met was someone who was working in a lab that I was working in when I was a grad student. And I hadn't thought so much about going to be a science writer or anything like that before that. And I realize now what I'll do is when I encounter people who have a job that I'm not so familiar with, I'll talk to them as if I'm going to have to write about the job the next day, right? Not just to make small talk, but like I want to know, how did they get into that job? Like, what are the problems you typically face in that job? Like, what are your challenges? What are the skills people have? How do people usually get into it? And I find if you do it that way, you learn a lot about a lot more jobs that are out there, right? Which is one of the fun things for me, but you just get broader idea of what's out there. So I think that's like the most simple way to start getting some insights, is to expose yourself to people who do different work and talk to them as if you're going to have to write about their job the next day and how they got into it. So that's the simple. The more concrete is take classes, sign up for different types of work, look around, maybe even in your industry for different job functions where you can take some of your skills already. So LinkedIn did some research recently where because they have these great databases so on 500,000 members, where they were looking at what are the best predictors of people who go on to become an executive. And the number one best predictor was they went to a top 5 MBA program. So, whatever. Like, and who knows the reasons for why that. But the second best predictor was the number of different job functions that they had worked across in industry. So each additional job function saved them about 3 years of experience in moving toward becoming an executive. And so I think there are a lot of opportunities to look around your own industry without taking a flying leap and say, I have some skills here. What other job functions, will I not be so behind on? And you can sort of move in discrete steps. Because I'll see things like, I don't know if you interact with companies a lot, but like this often like sales and marketing people are so siloed for me. And you're like, these people are the functions. These functions should be totally integrated, right? They should be switching jobs once in a while.
Yeah.
Like it's crazy how siloed it is. So I think there are a lot of opportunities without going nuts to not like lose all of your skills, to take some skills and transfer them to other functions in an industry and sort of do that in discrete steps so that you're not just, totally starting from scratch.
And if people want to do this and they want to kind of find the middle way, I think it could be easy to see this as generalist or specialist. But I think what you're talking about is a middle way, and then there's sort of dilettantes, or spreading yourself too thin.
Right.
How can people kind of find that sweet spot?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because this whole issue of generalist specialist, right? Something you're hitting on, maybe the subtext here is it's a semantic issue and a moving target, right? So in some of the studies in range, like in some areas it's quantified. So when I write about like patent research and technological innovation, the people who study patents and technological innovators, they can actually classify them, because the U.S. Patent Office has technology classes, and they'll say, well, a specialist is someone who's worked in like the same technology class for their entire career, and a generalist is someone who's worked in a certain number of technology classes across their career, right? And then a dilettante is someone who hasn't like gone that deep or that broad, basically, and they tend not to make that much of contributions in that area. Or in the comic book industry, like I write about some comic book research in the book, there it's the number of different genres that somebody has worked across, like determines if they're more of a generalist or more of a specialist. So there's some areas where it's actually quantified, but in the larger sense, it's something of a semantic issue, right? Where, like, one of the guys I loved, Oliver Smithies, who sort of twice revolutionized science, is a Nobel laureate in the last chapter, and he was training to be a doctor, and then he saw a chemistry lecture and was like, "Wait, I want to do that." And realized that he had this medical background. So as he put it, I wasn't afraid of biology, and then I wasn't afraid of chemistry either. And so he merges these, and he again, and then later at age 54, he took a sabbatical to learn genetics, and then at age 60 published the research that won him the Nobel Prize. But like, so he's a biochemist, right? Which any human being would identify as being hyper specialized, right? But at the time he did it, it wasn't that. It was like this bold new hybrid of like merging these two areas, right? So that was something that was like this integrator, and then it becomes its own specialist. Right? I like to think of the martial art Krav Maga, which is really popular now, where it's basically like an integration of aspects of 6 other martial arts forms plus some customizations, but then it becomes its own specialty, right? So these generalists can sort of become specialists anyway. And so I really think like the principles to keep in mind are, one, the search for match quality, where if you do it regularly, you will accumulate these broad experiences just by going about that. And secondly, this idea of continuing to run these experiments where you are doing things that would not occur just with the inertia of your daily experience, right? So you will broaden your skills and you will broaden your exposure to things. Even if you stay in the same job, you will broaden your toolbox. So I don't think it necessarily has to be about leaping out of your job. Like that might be right for some people, but I was hoping the last chapter was sort of the synthesis of showing people who are specialized, but how they harness the powers of range within that specialization by continuing to sort of look broadly, communicate with people outside their domain, use analogies from other domains.
Right.
They tend to read more and more widely than their peers. And they also tend to have hobbies more often. So like Nobel laureates are about 22 times more likely to have an aesthetic hobby than normal scientists. And I love this quote from, fiction writing, acting, magic, photography, whatever, woodworking. And National Academy scientists are much more likely than normal scientists, but not as likely as Nobel laureates. This quote from Santiago Ramon y Cajal, who's a Spanish Nobel laureate, best known as the father of modern neuroscience. And he recognized that these really sort of creative, innovative people had these wide interests, and that sometimes they were totally disconnected, but often they would kind of inform one another. And so his quote was, "To him who observes them from afar, it looks as though they are dissipating their energies when in fact they are channeling and strengthening them." And that's what a lot of psychologists who study creativity have seen, that there are these broad interests that from the outside look totally disconnected, but for the individual, they often end up, feeding into the way they think or the way they approach things or their interests.
So if people want to try these other interests, something that comes up for a lot of folks, and I heard you mention in another interview, is imposter syndrome, sort of an emotional block to getting out into a new sphere. What advice would you have for people who deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, I get that all the time, right? Like I was, after I wrote my first book, like I go, and especially, and I'm sure you probably got this too, because when you come out of science and whether or not you like what you're doing, you have cachet when you're in science, where it's like, I know stuff, because like just it comes with the title. And so then when you get out of that, I think at least I did. I felt like imposter syndrome because, you're not as specialized anymore.
Yeah. And me too, for sure. I went from grad school into the military. And so I'm with these guys who have been in the Naval Academy for 4 years, and they've got private pilot's licenses and things. And then I'm in flight training, and I don't know what I'm doing. But I had to step in and just own it. But definitely, like you said, I lost that credibility that I had when I could lean on my science credentials. Yeah,
totally. And I think, I mean, I don't want to pretend like I know how to totally conquer that, because I still get it plenty. But what I try to do is, if I have to talk to someone about it, like for a while before, now whatever, I've had these books have done fine and everything. And so now I don't really have to explain my weird background the same way I did when I was applying for jobs earlier, where that attuned me, first of all, to the need to, when I was applying for things, to have a narrative of like why my background looked so zigzaggy, right? Instead of just being like, oh, that science stuff was something that was a waste and I just got off track. It actually turned out to be incredibly powerful for me as a writer. And, so explaining my career zigzags as one of personal development. And by the way, I write a little bit in Range about the Pat Tillman Foundation, which I've now gotten more and more involved with every year. And now I'm on the final selection committee, right? So it's like, talk about imposter syndrome. It's like me and a 3-star general and like, but they want, it's like 8 people, but they want half of them to be civilians, right? So anyway, but yes, I definitely have plenty of imposter syndrome there. But one of the things I notice is when the people who win the scholarships, and all these scholarships are helping them do career transitions and things like that, they will have these odd backgrounds. A lot of them did not go straight into the military. Something happened that led them into the military. Some of them went to academies, but not most of them. And then they're applying for this scholarship because something that happened to them in Afghanistan, or some of them are military spouses, something they observed, about the social systems as they had to move around to bases and all these things, will have cued something that they decide they really want to work on. Or they realize that they're good at something that they didn't expect, or they handle pressure in a way that they didn't expect, and they'll have the ones who win it, again, will have this great narrative where if you just looked at their resume, you'd be like, these would look like they were sort of discrete bubbles. Yeah. But then with their narrative, you see like, oh, this is this super interesting Venn diagram. And that's why this person is interested in this very interesting problem, because they've had these unique experiences that sort of coalesce around something. And so I think I try to think of my zigzagginess as part of this narrative of personal development, and I think that helps me feel a little bit less like an imposter. But also, I think, um, when I'm doing my reporting, I have to. Sometimes I think science writers. Maybe I'm going a little off topic here, but sometimes I think science writers, um, maybe writers in general, want their interview subjects to like see how smart they are. Yeah, who doesn't when you're
Sure.
talking to someone?
Sure.
But for me, my job is to be able to explain stuff to people who have never been exposed to it. And so I've had to get myself in the habit of mind of not worrying too much if I ask a question that seems silly to the person on the other end, and just hoping that when they see the final product, they will have said, "Oh, okay, now I get it," and those sorts of things. So I just put my sort of professional face on and say, like, this the final product is what's most important. And if this person thinks I'm a little silly, that's okay for now, and hopefully they'll like the final product. And I just try to remember that, and also to have, I think it always helps to have some areas of competence, right? Because anybody should be able to be, unless they have a massive ego, be able to made to feel like an imposter if you put them in a certain situation. So
Right.
I think it's and yeah, so I think it's to have some humility, and also it's good to have areas of competence as well. But
Yeah, I could take a lot from that on the interview bit too. I have people who will say things or who I can be intimidated by. I talked to a 2-star general last week, and like that's when I'm in a bit over my head, and to not be so eager to show off what I have, but to remember to highlight those people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I do think there's an approach, right? Like, even if you don't know much about what you're doing, I think if you're sort of good to people, like, things will go okay, even if you are being an imposter at the moment. I don't think a bit of imposter syndrome is bad. I actually think it breeds some humility and some drive, So I'm not necessarily, maybe it may be uncomfortable, but some of the things I wrote about, like the penultimate chapter of Range is about, in a different way, but about how you can make an organizational culture uncomfortable for people in a way that forces them to learn, but it still makes them uncomfortable. Like, they may not enjoy it as much, but it will make them better at what they're doing. And so I don't think the feeling of discomfort is necessarily bad. Maybe we should think about it more as we do in the feeling of discomfort when we're training for distance running. You don't think of it as bad. You think of it as necessary, so that you can feel better when you have to do the real work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If people want to future-proof themselves a little bit, how could they pick skills and things to touch on when they are exploring match quality?
Yeah, I mean, future-proofing themselves, like, as the work world is changing, like, really, really rapidly.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing, and this isn't in Range, but I write a little bit about the different types of skills that computers are good at, and the sort of broader skills that humans are better at. And I was looking at some examples of technological change over time, and, like, just to pick one that I can explain shortly, when the ATM came online, the prediction was that bank tellers would go, like, totally out of business, overnight. But in fact, what's happened as ATMs have proliferated is we've had more bank tellers. And that's because branches have become cheaper for banks to operate because of the ATM. So they've opened more branches, fewer tellers per branch, but more tellers overall. But it has completely changed the job from one of someone who does these repetitive transactions to one of someone who's like a customer service agent and a marketing professional, and this much broader mix of, often softer skills that often have to deal with human behavior. And things that deal with human behavior are areas where, like, AI has not made very many inroads yet. So I think we can all lean on improving our ability to deal with people and to learn about human behavior, and learning about cognitive biases, right? Like, there's a ton of interesting work done about cognitive biases, about how people make decisions, about how people judge other people, that I think anyone would do well to be familiar with, because they're so important to any line of work. And I think focusing early on really diversifying your mental models. I don't want to steal a phrase from Shane Parrish. I don't know if you read Farnham Street at all, but he took from Charlie Munger this idea that what you want is a large collection of mental models in your head that you can then use and try to match the right model to the right sort of predicament. And I think that shows up in. So the chapter 5 of Range is about using analogies from one domain to solve problems in another domain.
Mm-hmm.
And I love this one kind of anecdote or story or study where Deidre Gentner at Northwestern is like the world's expert in doing this, using analogies to solve problems in other domains. And she created this task where essentially it tests how good someone is at recognizing the structure of problems in domains, across domains. And she gives it to these Northwestern students. And a bunch of the students are pretty good at solving a problem in their domain, like something they've been taught already. But only a subset of the students are good at solving it outside of their domain. And those are the students who are in this thing called the integrated science program, where they don't have a major. They just have like all these minors where they learn sort of the modes of pursuing the truth in different disciplines. And the interesting thing was, when I went around and talked to some of her colleagues, they're like, yeah, we're not in love with that program because those kids get behind because they don't have sort of a real major. And so I'm thinking, like, here you have on your faculty the world's expert in this very important kind of problem solving, telling you here are the students we're doing the best with, and her own colleagues saying like, yeah, those kids are getting behind. I'm like, come on, like this is what you want, because what you want is transfer. What psychologists, when they use the word transfer, is the ability to take your skills and knowledge and apply them to problems you have not seen before, as opposed to ones you have seen before, because that's what you need in a fast-changing work world. And there's this classic research finding that can be summarized as breadth of training predicts breadth of transfer. That is, your ability to take that knowledge and apply it to situations you haven't seen before is predicted by how broad your training was. So you want to face a huge number of different problems. You want to be exposed to a huge number of different mental models from different disciplines. And so I think we should think of our early training like the integrated science program, right? Like have a minor in a bunch of different things. Expose yourself to the ways of thinking of a lot of different disciplines. And you can focus in later, but that will serve you for a long time. And if you're really interested in that diversification of mental models, like Charlie Munger has kind of famously talked about that. So I leave the details to him.
I didn't know that. He's the big investor. He's like Warren
Buffett's
partner.
Warren Buffett. Yeah.
Wow.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. So if you Google like him and mental model, I think he says, and I think he even like quantified. He's like, you need like 109 mental models or something like that. Anyway, but yeah. So he talks about that diversifying those, and another thinker in the investment area that I think is interesting about this is named Michael Mauboussin, and he's on the board also of the Santa Fe Institute, which is this institute that is essentially created because to break down silos between researchers, right? To have interdisciplinary research, and it's amazing place. And Michael wrote a book called More Than You Know that's basically about like how important it is to diversify your mental models in like investing, basically.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is the value of reading widely? Because this seems to be something that comes up, and I've heard you talk about, and I see you're surrounded by books. How does that help you? Because it's also a convenient way to kind of get exposed for people who might be in situations where they're not going to be able to go to a networking lunch or something.
For sure. When you think of the potential value of some books, like the cost of the books, it's like bananas. It's like the best return. Some books are like the absolute best return on investment of anything I've like ever spent in my entire life. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't always an avid reader, I got to say. I sort of came to that late, and now I'm like totally voracious. And for me, I mean, one of the very concrete values for me is similar. I feel this way, and I saw that two people I respect, Christopher Nolan, the director, and Eric Larson, the great nonfiction writer, they both had very similar quotes that I came across that were to the effect of, between my big projects, I just need to read widely with no apparent purpose, right? And I guess the apparent purpose is probably they're looking for their next project, but you don't really know where that's going to come from. And I find that same thing. Like, I don't know where something that's going to sort of like light my motivational fire is necessarily going to come from. So I try to read really widely. And for both of my books, the first year I don't really write at all. I try to read 10 scientific journal articles a day, every day for a year. And that leads to that's like, that's not necessarily books, but it's pretty wide reading. And I've come to believe, I used to chastise myself for thinking that I was very inefficient, because sometimes I'll go down some rabbit hole and I'm trying to find some, more detail about something. And then I come up like a week later and I'm like, how the hell did I ever think that was going to be useful? And so I used to say, like, gosh, if I could just get more efficient, like things would, be so good. But I realize, or I think maybe this is just self-justification, I'm not sure, but that first of all, being fortunate enough to have the time to do something like that for a year, but also, the time and the willingness means that my competitive advantage in many ways is like how expansive my personal search function is, essentially, because that's how I find things, one, that other people aren't necessarily finding, but also that the actual experts in all these areas that I then integrate for a book, they're not seeing each other really, even though their work bears on the same questions. That's true of both my books. Very much like there was all this work that bears on the same central question, but none of the people know each other or talking to each other or realize it. And so for me, I mean, reading widely is one pleasure. Two, it makes people think you're super smart. I was just talking to someone else about this, who's this guy who now he's like a CTO of a tech company and like a very prominent doctor and all this stuff. And he was saying the same thing. He's like, people think I'm super, yeah, he is really smart, but he's like, people think I'm like super smart just because I read a lot. Right. And so he was saying like one of the big advantages was people just think he's super smart because in a conversation, he can always think of something interesting that like relates to it. So he's always useful in the conversation. So he said now he even built like a little shelf in his shower and he'll put the audiobook on like when he's showering because he just wants to like get as many books in as possible. But you do notice that, right? Like your fluid intelligence declines from like, I don't know, the age of 16 or something. So your ability to learn certain things like really, really quickly, but crystallized intelligence, which is actually knowing stuff, continues to go up basically until and unless you get dementia when you're older, pretty much. And so I think we should keep that in mind. Like you're not going to get over full of information. We have like tons of brain space to retain stuff. And if you're reading really widely, you start to see connections between things. You build a semantic network. And I do it both for pleasure and because this is how I kind of find my projects. But also if you're going to be a writer, I think it really behooves you to read a lot, and not just to read a lot, but pay attention to structure and things like that. So it serves many purposes for me. Yeah. And I know people, and I quote Arturo Casadevall, one of the most prominent scientists and immunologists in the world, in the last chapter, saying he tells his people, read something outside of your field every day. And he said they tell him like, I don't have time to do it. And he said, you do, because it's more important than the other thing that you're doing. Do it every day, basically. And that's how some of his most important projects, and I mentioned in the book his H index, which is a scientist's rating of how productive they are and how often they're cited by other scientists, recently passed Einstein's. Which is not, I should say, is not, and I put this in a footnote, it's not totally fair because scientists publish a lot more than they used to, but that still puts him on a list of like 1,000 people ever, basically, so, and including people like, like Freud has a higher H index than Einstein. So he's in all of scientists ever that are in the database, he's like, in still toward the top. And some of his projects, like one of his projects where he and a colleague discovered a type of mold that can eat radiation came from this news article that he was reading about Chernobyl. And there was some robots sent into Chernobyl to like collect samples of something or something like that. And they came back with this, or maybe they just took images of this like black mold. So it looked like, a grotty shower curtain that was all over the walls of one of the reactors. And so he just sort of thought like, that's interesting that like mold would be able to grow in that environment. And it, one thing leads to another, and they end up finding this totally unique method of metabolism with this mold that essentially eats radiation, not radioactive compounds, radiation itself. Right. And this comes out of him just like because he reads like lots of news articles, and sometimes you get a clue. And that was when I was working on long investigative stories. Most cases, not all, but most cases, you see like some little clue in some like local article or in some report or something like that. And you start to think like, I wonder what happens if I pull on that thread more, and I don't know of any way to do that in a really targeted way. You just have to kind of like read widely and follow your gut.
Well, David, if people want to read along with what you're writing, where should people look for you online?
They can find me at davidepstein.com, and I'm at David Epstein on Twitter.
Excellent. Well, we'll put links to both of those and, of course, your book, Range, in the show notes.
Thank you.
And, David, my final question is, and you mentioned that you have a chapter that kind of hits on this. What do you think a leader can do to create a culture where the organization can thrive in this generalist sort of way?
Yeah, two specific things. One, and can I give you an analogy for this one?
Please.
So I like to think about this because I was actually talking to like a company recently, and they were wondering about their development pipeline for younger workers, and One thing, well, okay, one, they should keep in mind the fact that how important match quality is. So everyone's obsessed with grit now, right? And as one of the
Yeah.
researchers, Range told me, when you get fit, it looks like grit, which means that when you get people good match quality, they will display the attributes associated with grit anyway, right? Work ethic and resilience.
Yeah.
So if you get them to fit, it looks like grit. Fit is what psychologists call a state, not a trait, right? It's not inherent to a person across everything they do. It's a function of that person in a certain context. So I think we should stay attuned to that. And we should make our development pipelines a little bit adjustable in that. And here's the analogy. In the 1950s, when jet planes were proliferating, the Air Force was having lots of non-combat crashes. They had 17 on one weekend. And first they blamed some pilot error. Then they wondered about their new cockpits. The cockpits were based on the average measurements of pilots. And they tasked this young Lieutenant Gilbert Daniels to go figure out what's going on. And he decides to measure 4,000, I think it was 4,063 pilots on all these different body segments, shoulder breadth, their forearm length, everything. And what he finds is that if you pick only 3 different measurements, only 3.5% of the pilots fit the average. And the average was the middle 30 percentiles, so it's pretty liberal. If you go up to 10 measurements, 0 fit it, right? So in designing the cockpit for the average pilot, they made a cockpit that fits nobody at all. And so they responded to this by making adjustable cockpits, right? And I think we should think about our development pipelines so much come out of Taylorism and this kind of thinking and efficiency thinking that we make them cookie cutter and average. And so only the people that fit a certain mold have an easier time coming through it. Other people might come through in spite of that. But I think we should think about building in a little bit of adjustability into, into our development systems. So I don't know if you're out in LA. Bill Simmons does his podcast from out in LA, and and I was there not that long ago, and that's one of the happiest workplaces. Maybe I shouldn't shoot my mouth off about his workplace, but it was one of the happiest workplaces I've been around, and I think part of that is because people have an ability to try things out a little bit. So one of my colleagues, Mallory Rubin from Sports Illustrated, who quite frankly, I had no idea she was brilliant person at Sports Illustrated because she didn't have opportunities to do a lot of things. And then she gets hired as an online editor at The Ringer, and they allow her to come on a podcast one day, and next thing you know, she's it's this incredible podcaster, and I didn't even know that she had that in her. And one of the other guys, Sean Fennessy, who's the director of content, was hired for some other job, and then they let him try some things, and he rises up. So I think that's important to try to build in the allowance for people who want to try dabbling some things and discovering some talents. And lastly, I think you're referring to the penultimate chapter of the book is about how leaders hold people accountable in an organization. And business students are widely taught that you need to aim for congruence, which means you have all the cultural signals pointing in one direction, so everything is self-reinforcing. And in fact, it turns out that you can have too much congruence, where if everything is reinforcing toward people having a certain process, then they will often make errors of mindless conformity, where they'll stick to the process even when to an outsider it's clear that that's leading to disaster. And on the other hand, if it's all accountability based on outcome, then they will recklessly deviate even from good processes all the time. So the way that you balance people and they won't learn, neither way will learn. They'll do it over and over and over in both directions. So the way you get people to actually learn from their experiences is by balancing the culture so you have some process and some outcome accountability. So the way this is done in studies, for example, is when it was done on HR managers and they had to predict, they were given sort of fake applications and had to predict how the employee then did, and they could see the results right away and see how well they were doing. And the question was, will they learn? And if they were told you'll be evaluated just on the process you follow, then they would stick to the process even when it was clearly not working and better one was easily discoverable. If they were told you'll only be judged on the accuracy of your predictions, then they didn't use the process even when it obviously would work better than what they did. And so the way to balance this, the scientists would give them fake research, from the Harvard Business Review, that would say, so for the process accountable people, they'd give them fake research that said, successful teams prize individuality of thought and dissent and all these things. And suddenly you'd have these cultural counter pressures, and those people would start learning from all of their experiences, where they would deviate when it made sense, but they would stick to the process unless they had a reason to deviate. And for the people who are held outcome accountable, they would give them fake research that said successful teams prize cohesion, and consensus and all this stuff. And then you'd see the same effect there. And so in some cases, the people didn't enjoy that as much in organizations because they feel that tension, but that's a healthy tension apparently. And so I think it's on a leader to try to set up some of the cultural incongruence that saves people from making either mistakes of mindless conformity or mistakes of reckless deviance.
Yeah, that's really refreshing. Thanks so much for coming on the show, David. This was great.
It's my pleasure, and it's cool that we have such like a similar background. So I'm not surprised this resonated with you.
Yeah. Hey everybody, thanks so much for checking out this episode with David Epstein. If you want to help me get more great guests like this on the show, then be sure to interact with this. If you're watching it on YouTube, leave a comment. If you're listening to the podcast, then be sure to give us a review, especially on Apple Podcasts. That's a huge help, and we'll catch you next time.